This is Fan66 and today I'm here with HobbyKing Avios MIG-17 90mm EDF-Jet. This plane is not exactly new and I bought it in November 2019. It arrived a few days later undamaged in a nice cardboard box at my doorstep. I unpacked it and checked everything, and for once everything seemed in order. The regular viewers among you know that HobbyKing and me does not have the best track record. Anyway, this time everything seemed fine and I started with the build. And to talk about the build is a bit of an overstatement. Assembly is more like it, because I just needed about 30 minutes to put this thing together. And while I put this thing together, the first problems appeared on my radar. Not that there was anything really broken. The problems lie in the details. Stuff like flaps that were glued shut, loose screws, screws that were screwed into the foam and not into the plastic, or simply missing screws. All these faults were not difficult to repair, nor to find if you were looking for them. Still, any of these mistakes could bring your plane down. So from my point of view, HobbyKing's quality control did not get any better. But of course there's not only bad stuff. For your euro or whatever currency you are using, you get a sturdy frame, a powerful and pretty efficient drive system, and a very tough looking trailing landing gear. So overall I think it is still a good package, if you are aware of the limitations of cheap Chinese manufacturing, of course. So if you already have a little bit of experience in the hobby, and if you like to tinker, to build or to mod your planes, this one might be the right one for you. On the other hand, if you're not into that kind of stuff, I would suggest you give HobbyKing a really wide berth. While we can certainly argue about manufacturing quality, the actual flight characteristics of this bird are very nice, and its tough trailing link landing gear makes it almost ideal for operation on grass fields, which is certainly something not every EDF is suited for. So I replaced the screws and repaired the other little mistakes, and of course I installed landing and positioning lights before I went off to the field for the maiden flight. CG-wise, I relied on the so-called tail sitting test, which you can learn about on RC groups if you are interested. After that, I checked the power system and my controller for the last time, and then prepared for takeoff. As you can hear, we had pretty strong winds at the field, but as you can see, the MiG didn't really care about it. Oh, and please don't expect too much from this maiden flight. Pilot, controller and plane are rarely in sync during those events. CG-wise everything was fine, maybe not perfect, but okay, and of course I had to do some trimming here and there. Of course I was nervous as hell, because this is my first bigger jet, meaning 90mm. But the way she flew inspired confidence, and after a minute or so I started to calm down a bit. I tried to fly big wide circles over the field and try to get a good feeling for the plane. As you can see, it is not the fastest plane. During the maiden I was cruising around mostly with about 60% throttle. I knew from other pilots and from RC groups that the power system in this bird is pretty efficient. So with a 6S 5000 mAh battery I loaded into the plane, I could expect about 4 minutes of flight time, at least the way I fly. Probably even more with a few low power or power off glides in between. And this plane in particular has the reputation to be very floaty, a good glider. And while this special ability is a very nice thing to have while you're up in the air, it can make landings a little more interesting than some of us like. Wind speed and wind direction made a tail landing too dangerous, at least for my taste, so I had to come in from the west, which is over a small patch of wood. Also not really ideal for a maiden flight, because the wind that comes through a little opening in the trees usually creates a pretty nasty turbulence that can planes around pretty good, even bigger ones than mine. The first test approach went pretty well, so I turned around and put down the gear.
Ja, ik denk ook.
3 green indeed. Time for landing. Because of the strong gust of winds, I decided not to go with flaps on the landing. Certainly not my best landing. And here clearly the tough landing gear of the MiG-17 saved my ass. Big time. But she was down in one piece, so I take it. I took another 2 test flights a few days later, which were pretty much uneventful. Just more testing and refining the plane. So the first step had been made, the plane was flight worthy. It was time to start to think about a new color scheme for this plane. Not that the original camo was that bad, just not what I had in mind. My first idea was to go with the East German color scheme, but then I thought it looked a little bit too, well, boring. So I took my time and started to look for suitable camos on the internet. Of course there were a whole bunch of camos for this plane available, because our good friends in the USSR distributed this plane all over the world during the Cold War. But then I got lucky, because my old buddy Jörg, who was building his own MiG, pushed my interest into a direction I never really thought about. So I started to look at air forces of Algeria, Libya, Egypt or Syria, which were all equipped with MiG-17s during the 50s. And it didn't take long before I stumbled over a very cool looking Egyptian camo scheme for the MiG. A 3-color camo with all the features I was looking for. Bright sand yellow as a base color for good visibility, and a darker camo net on top of it for good contrast. The underside of the wings and the fuselage would be in some kind of blue-grayish color, which should make it easier to determine which side is up and which side is down, at least in theory. But before I could put a new camo scheme on this thing, I had to deal with the peripherals, like the wheel wells or the missing cockpit. Not to forget the air brakes, or the flaps of course. I saw a few MiGs with interior green in the wheel wells, not necessarily the Egyptian ones, but I thought it was a cool looking color and it would pop with a planned camo. Over the following days, or should I say weeks, I started to design the cockpit. In videos or slideshows like this, these kind of things take like 20 seconds. But in the real world it takes quite a bit longer. By the way, all the 3D printed parts are designed and printed by my own. But of course the cockpit was not the only problem. I had to find a suitable pilot for this thing. Of course at first I looked online for a printable version, because designing a 3D printable pilot figure by my own is beyond my capabilities. But then I stumbled over a suitable pilot from the Freewing Yak 130. He was not an exact fit and his arm position were a bit wrong, but he had the right size and his gear was not too modern, so I adjusted his height and his arm length with a saw. to make him fit exactly into the cockpit of this MiG. And of course his orange jumpsuit and his white helmet had to go as well. So I looked at a few Egyptian pilots on the internet as a reference and grabbed my airbrush. And of course I did a few test fits in between, just to make sure that the new colors don't get into a fight with the Russian cockpit green. No idea how Russian pilots do it. I mean, flying the plane with the cockpit color like that. I would probably puke my breakfast over the instrument panel twice a day. And while talking about instruments, I weathered the main panel and cut out the printed instruments and glued them into the main instrument panel. Not super difficult, but time consuming, because you have to work really precise. And now back to the pilot. I chose yellow as a base color for the helmet. A few layers of yellow and light red later, I was happy with the color. A few shadows on the uniform, plus a few details on helmet and mask, and I was almost ready. Overall, not that bad, I think. A few small decals on the pilot, rank insignia on its shoulders and a small Egyptian flag on his left arm complete the look. And here's the finished pilot in its new working space. After finishing the cockpit, I turned my attention back to the plane. I gave the whole thing a light sanding, cleaned it, removed all the linkages, and started with a blue-gray base coat. After the base coat had dried, I started to apply the sand yellow, the main color of the plane. I let the plane dry a few days before I started to apply the carbonate of light green, followed by the second color of dark chocolate brown. A very interesting color scheme in my opinion. After I finished the main color scheme of the plane, I started to work on the details, like antennas, gun ports, panel lines and such. A part of a mod that is frequently overlooked and can take quite a lot of time. And here's a finished plane. The Avios MiG-17 in the colors of the Egyptian Air Force. I'm very sorry that I can only show you a few hunger pics right now, but the weather here in Germany is so bad that to take photos outside is almost impossible. But of course I will bring you a follow-up video as soon as we have flight-worthy conditions here. So I hope you guys enjoyed my little slideshow, and if you like to know anything in particular about this plane or this video, please leave a comment below. Have fun at the flying field, guys. Warbird Fan 66 out.